Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided. This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy is sponsored by Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with the intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Products include Westlaw, Practical Law, and Firm Central legal practice management software for small law firms. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the Greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is Life Illuminated. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan, acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. A Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology. Look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Hi, welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm Roxanne Meshar, and I'm your host for today. And my guest joining me is State Representative Erin Murphy, also candidate for governor for the state of Minnesota. Erin, welcome to Access to Democracy. So nice to have you with us.
I'm so happy to be here today.
So this is a nice opportunity for viewers to get to hear a little bit about your priorities in governing, your experience, your background. So let's start with, say, your background. Let people know kind of how you got into politics and kind of the story of Erin Murphy, so we can learn a little more about you.
So I grew up in a family that loved to talk about politics. I was born in a small town in Wisconsin, Columbus, Wisconsin, and when I got together with my great big family, the adults would play cards, and I hung out with them inside while all my cousins ran the neighborhood. I mixed the drinks for the adults who were playing cards, and I hung out and listened to them talk about their belief in politics, about their belief and their participation in our community in such a way that they could build a future. And I worked on my very first campaign in 8th grade. I had a great experience campaigning for a classmate's dad, and he won his election.
Wow.
And
8th grade.
8th grade, that's right. We were lid droppers and bumper sticker appliers.
Okay.
And I, in practice saw that even as a young person, I was able to contribute in my own way and make a difference in that election.
That's important,
Yeah.
because even as adults, people don't always realize how much of a difference individuals can really make. So you had that experience very early on.
I did, and I still believe in it.
Yeah, good for
and I've
you.
got lots of proof that it is still the case in Minnesota, that we can build a future using a kind of politics that improves people's lives.
Nice. So out of that then, you didn't immediately go from high school to be a state representative. So say a little more. How did that part of your story work?
Yeah, I chose nursing.
Okay.
I went to school and got a degree in nursing and practiced first in a rural hospital in Wisconsin, and then came here to practice at the University of Minnesota.
Nice.
And I was a surgical nurse and a transplant nurse, but knew when I was taking care of people who were really sick that there were things happening outside of the walls of the hospital that were impacting the health of the people I was caring for. And that was what sparked my interest in marrying together, if you will, my interest in politics and public policy and nursing. I worked for 14 years for the Minnesota Nurses Association as an organizer. I was there when we passed Minnesota Care 25 years ago, organizing nurses support for that. I worked as a lobbyist for M&A and then eventually as their executive directors, and did that, running that large organization, balancing their budget, hiring and firing the staff, negotiating our contracts for 7 years.
Quite a job, yeah.
It was a good teacher, let me tell you.
And then, so after coming out of that experience, healthcare, and seeing a lot of the policy changes maybe that drive what happens in healthcare, how did you end up running for state representative?
So I, for many, many years, working with the nurses, had worked to make sure people had access to good coverage, believing if they had good coverage, they'd get good care by the hospitals and the doctors and nurses that worked there. In 2004, my mom, who had a very, very strong point of view about politics, but was an introvert, she decided that she was going to campaign for John Kerry. She was real frustrated with the war in the Middle East. And so she door knocked during that year for John Kerry, and we know that he didn't win his election. And after that election, my mom learned that she had lung cancer. My mom was a smoker, and so was my dad. And she was always worried that this was going to happen. And she asked for my help and the help of my siblings. So for the next 11 months, I spent time back in Janesville, Wisconsin. That's where my mom and dad lived, taking care of her. And even though they had really good coverage, and my parents had worked hard to earn their way, my dad built cars for a living at the GM plant in Janesville that's now closed, and my mom was a grocery store clerk, and she cleaned vegetables at the canning factory, and she cleaned houses for a living. I did that with her. They had good coverage, and she still had to fight with the insurance company to get some of the treatment she needed when she was going through her cancer treatment, and frankly, it made me really angry. Yeah. And at her funeral, her sisters said, "You should do something about that." And I had been working in our politics in Minnesota for a long time, but hadn't really ever made a decision to run for office. And I came back, and the seat that I currently hold was open. The person that had it was running for Attorney General. So I threw my hat in the ring. It was in November, and there were a lot of people who said they would help me, but they didn't think I could win because it was a very competitive race. And one person in particular had been campaigning already for quite a while, earning support in the district, but we worked very hard. I figured out how to tell my story about what I was experiencing, but I also learned that the most important job that I had as a candidate was to listen. I started door knocking in December, and I knocked the heck out of that district until the November election. And behind every door there was a story of a family or of a Minnesotan that was living their life, and they had a lot to share with me. And it was the right preparation to represent the district. And I haven't stopped. I've continued to door knock now for 11 years, and I feel like I am filled with the stories of Minnesota, and I'm happy to share them as I'm campaigning across the state now.
Listening to hear you talk, you could be a pastor because it's also about stories and listening. Yeah. Very much so. And I think really anytime we're serving other people and the public or groups at large, it is about listening to people's stories and hearing the truth in those stories and becoming adept at listening. So you've had ample opportunities now to do that. And I think you've been traveling a little bit even this summer.
Yes.
In and around Minnesota. So
I was in Clarissa, Minnesota in August for a Farmers Union picnic, and had a chance to speak there for a little bit, and then met their new priest for that parish, and he said, "You sound like me, speaking from the pulpit." Yeah, so there you go. I think it is always important to listen, to really understand what the problem is. When I ran that first time, every campaign tries to figure out what their message is, and I promised to listen to Minnesotans to really understand what the problem was, and then I would act to solve that problem. And that has continued to be a guide for me, even though I don't always say I'm going to listen, diagnose, and act anymore. It continues to be a guide because I think Minnesotans do expect us, when they elect us, not just to fight for what you believe in, but also to find solutions and make progress for the people of Minnesota.
It's true. If we put our heads together and we do listen carefully, we can find solutions. It's probably not going to be what we anticipated or what we expected, but good solutions are out there. So when we put our heads together. You mentioned listen, diagnose, act, and I know those are three important key words for your campaign, actually. Maybe say a little more about that in relationship to your vision for Minnesota.
So I have a lot of faith in us. And I have seen over and over again, both as my work as a nurse and my work as an elected official, our capacity to wrestle with a challenge and find a solution. And I want to be the governor for the state of Minnesota because I want to build our bright future. And I want to do that with the people of Minnesota. I have, as I said, spent a lot of time with Minnesotans, and they have taught me all about our great big state, about our regional economies, our way of life, our cultural differences, the things that bring us together and make us Minnesota. And I think that's the right preparation more than anything to represent the interests of the state. And then to bring that skill that I learned as a nurse, which is decision making. You can't walk away from a patient even when the situation is really hard, especially when the situation is really hard. You have to tend to what's in front of you. And too often in our politics now, we are walking away from the things that challenge us, that divide us, that are hard for us. And I think we have to step into that breach to find the path forward on things that are important to us, whether it is infrastructure, if it is a transportation bill, making sure that everyone has health care that they can count on, tackling the things in front of us that will build the future of the state of Minnesota so that the place that we call home remains that for the people who come after us. I think that's our job.
Yes.
Yeah.
What generations, what are we leaving to generations in the future?
That's right.
You mentioned healthcare, and we'll come back to the other topics as well. They're all important topics. But for sure, you have a background in nursing, so healthcare near and dear to your heart. So, and it's a big issue for you. Say more about your vision for healthcare for Minnesotans.
I'm a single payer supporter.
Okay.
I think it is important that people have health care that they can count on, and it's time for us, again in Minnesota, to lead like we did 25 years ago and show the nation that it is possible to put people before the profits of the institutions that provide care. I haven't seen, in all the years that I've been working in healthcare, the kind of behavior that I've seen in the last couple of years in Minnesota from the insurance companies and the health systems and the drug companies that really are, without hiding it at all, putting their profit-making interests before those of people who need care. I talked to a gentleman when I was at Farm Fest in August. His wife was admitted to the hospital, but she was admitted to observation, and he didn't know that. And she was in the hospital. He thought she was a patient there, discharged, went to a nursing home, and he got a $14,000 bill that he didn't anticipate because an observation bed isn't paid for in the same way as an acute care bed in that hospital. He called it a damned dirty loophole. I call it a way for people to make money off of people's sickness. That shouldn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
Healthcare is really important to people. It's important to our economy. It's a job provider all over the state of Minnesota. It's critical that we get it right. But we led when we passed Minnesota Care 25 years ago, and I think it's time for us again to lead. I would like to use Minnesota Care as the vehicle, establish networks directly with providers, move the insurance companies out of the middle of that transaction, and make sure that we're putting doctors and nurses in charge of the care that's being provided. I have a lot of faith in them, and I think we're going to get a healthier population, but it's going to be more affordable and more reliable for people, and it's time that we do it.
Yeah, time, and we can do it, as you said.
Yeah.
It never ceases to amaze me as I travel now, and I think I mentioned tiny countries like Slovenia or Mauritius, fully covered single-payer health care for all of their citizens. And Mauritius, the size of Hennepin County, the same size population and geographical size. Slovenia, smaller than the state of Minnesota, but they certainly are capable of putting the best of their citizens first and manage to do that. So there's no reason we can't do the same here.
That's
so
right.
I agree. Yeah, that's nice to know. Education, of course, you mentioned earlier, and that's another important issue. And I just want to give you some time to share with people your vision for education for the state of Minnesota.
All over the state, Minnesotans recognize how important education is for us, for our children, but also for our communities and for our economic future. I think it's important that we have strong public schools. That is our obligation. It's in our Constitution. So strong public schools all over the state of Minnesota for our kids. We have to have an eye on the economy of our future and make sure that the education that kids are getting is preparing for them not only to participate but to really build that economy of our future. It troubles me greatly that we have the achievement gap that we have here in the state of Minnesota, and really want to dig in with early learning and early intervention for kids who will come to school behind if we don't. That includes good prenatal care, of course,
Yes.
but also home visiting to help families and parents get off to a good start with their young kids.
And not all families have opportunities for a good start. Many families have undue burdens that any of us could have happen at any time, whether it's health issues or economic issues or all kinds of other things, because life is what it is and things happen. So yes.
That's right. And when I listen to teachers and experts in education, my friend Katie Smith, former Minnesota Teacher of the Year as a parent educator, she reminds me that she's never met a parent that doesn't love their child, but she has met parents that don't know how to parent yet.
Yes.
And she has been, just an awesome guide for me to remind me that we can, with small intervention, help those young learners prepare, to help families make sure their kids get off to a great start. So when they come to school, they're ready to do what we need them to do.
Yes.
And then last, I want to make sure that our two-year institutions, our four-year institutions are both affordable, and we've got a lot of kids coming out of school with debt that's really holding them back.
Huge debt. Yeah.
Right, but also that we are thinking about not just a four-year education, but there are a lot of opportunities for kids in our two-year colleges, in the trades, in the hands-on kind of opportunities in work. We want to make sure that those are available to, in the end, we want to make sure that people come through our schools ready to participate fully in the state so they can live the life of their choosing. And part of that is making sure you have a good job, that you can support yourself and your family. That's a key to our democracy. Healthcare, education, a good job, all fundamental to living the good life in Minnesota.
Very true. Even our Constitution says you have a right to life, and if you don't have good health care, how do you have a right to life then? And I often run into people who maybe children are grown or whatever, and they resent having to pay property taxes where a large portion is going for the school system, and yet we all benefit from well-educated population. Whether you have children in the school system or not is irrelevant. We all benefit from that. Corporations come here and we have a lower unemployment rate than most states because we have a well-educated population, and that's so important. We all personally benefit, but businesses benefit. I mean, everyone benefits from that. So yes, I may not have children in the school system, but it is important to me that the school system is good and
That's right.
Will educate people well. So for the future, for jobs that are coming up, and help people to think and think critically.
And lots of our schools and school districts are doing their very best with the streams of money that Minnesota is providing. But I'm watching districts struggle, especially in early learning, to put together pre-K opportunities for kids in their communities, to make sure that they are able to connect with families in a meaningful way. And we could make that work more effectively
Yes.
for kids. And if we listen to families across the state of Minnesota, they are really looking for high quality educational opportunities, including pre-K in the schools.
Yes, which means we do have to make sure we help those districts that are struggling, because we do use property taxes, which means if you are in a high household value or a high house sale value, your property taxes are higher and your school district gets a lot more money. And if you are in a community where the houses are much less expensive or economically struggling, you get a lot less money for schools. So it is our responsibility and challenge to make that work better, so every student gets an opportunity. Thank you. Let's talk about jobs a little bit. So we've had a very soft recovery nationwide. Minnesota has fared better than most, but we still struggle too since the recession, which seems to be ongoing and possibly starting anew. And many people now work 2 or 3 jobs. They have no benefits, so they may be employed, but the employment is not what we saw 20 or 30 years ago. So in your vision as governor, what would you do differently? What would be important for
We've
you?
already talked about education, and I think that's critical, right, to make sure that we've got a well-prepared workforce here. We already know that we have workforce shortages in the state of Minnesota. Up in the northwestern part of the state, and really in the urban core, we are short workers already, nurses, doctors, primary care physicians, pharmacists, teachers. So education, critical. I think we have to think about what our economy is going to look like in 10 and 20 years and drive us in that direction and create the jobs of our future. I'm really interested in more investment in biomedical research and biotech. I was the author of legislation that created a regenerative medicine fund here in the state of Minnesota. We did that in 2014. And it's doing two things. It is investing in research that is yielding, and I think very soon, spin-off collaborations into companies that will create, like we saw Medtronic do, opportunities. But it's also doing the important work of education for kids in different parts of the state around science and research, so that we're preparing the next generation of scientists and researchers that will continue to drive that economy. We're an economy in Minnesota that builds things, we grow things, we heal things. Those are our strengths. We need to continue to drive ourselves in that direction, staying ahead of the curve when we think about the economy, and make sure that we're matching our education with where we need to go in the state of Minnesota.
That's so important. You know, as a professor too, it's obvious that we are oftentimes training students for jobs that will not exist and not training students for jobs that will exist even in 4 or 5 years at the time that they graduate, which is why teaching people to think and to learn and to think critically is an important piece of that, because yes, the world is changing so quickly. So you're right, we need to look into the future and do as much as we can to prepare people for those jobs, not the jobs we think, not look through the rearview mirror.
That's right. A couple other things on that front, and this is not the job-specific issue, but I think it's important for us to recognize that Minnesota's got to be a place that continues to welcome people from other parts of the country and other parts of the world, because we're not quite keeping up with population as it is, and if we're already experiencing workforce shortages, we're going to need more people to come to Minnesota. So how do we make sure Minnesota is a place that welcomes people, that is a place where people want to come and live? We have to think about transportation and transit. I think we have to think more about race and equity, and make sure that we are open and open-minded about people coming from different parts of the world to participate and grow our future. And I also think it's important for us to remember that the middle class was built because workers came together and they organized, just like my dad did at UAW. And it's important that we recognize that people who work hard for a living aren't necessarily getting ahead right now. And it's in part because there's a lot of concentration of power in the hands of corporate interests. And we're going to have to continue either with law or with organizing to break that, so that everyone who works is able to support themselves and their families.
And government really is here to support voters, to support the community, to support the population, not corporations. Corporations need those conditions in which they can fairly and equitably run their businesses, but our primary responsibility is to our population. Well said by you, thank you. And to do that responsibly, to grow our economy and do the kinds of things that welcome people in. What you articulated are really key components of a really responsible immigration policy. So if we could even have that nationally, that would be ideal. So
it would be right and ideal if the Congress could really wrestle with and deliver a fair and modern immigration policy for the state and for the states. I don't have a lot of faith in them right now, in their capacity to do it, and so to the extent we can, we're going to have to tackle some of those issues here in Minnesota.
We can be the model, you know. We don't have to wait. I'm a strong advocate for local government and state government, where you can make an impact and we can move forward and model good ways that it can be done. So no reason we can't do that. I want to check into climate change. Actually, another critical factor, as we've seen this week, and it's facing Minnesota as well, before we end our conversation. So we're facing some real challenges with climate change, global warming, and what policies would you promote to address this area?
When I was first elected, for a brief 2-year window of time, there was a real sentiment here in Minnesota across the political lines, if you will, that climate change was real and we needed to do something about it. It's when we first passed the Renewable Energy Standard. And it has yielded, setting that standard has yielded real change in the state of Minnesota, and it's time for us to raise that up again. I think as I look across the state, the participants, especially the energy producers, understand that renewables are the way of our future, and they're investing there. So this is a real opportunity for Minnesota, one that doesn't come easily for us because there are now people who continue to be climate deniers. But I think when we look at the marketplace, when we look at the way that the energy companies are engaging, we are seeing more investment in wind, more investment in solar, more investment in water, in a way that we will continue to make progress on that front. I think every state and local government needs to step in and contribute to the solutions to climate change if the United States is going to back out of that Paris Agreement. It's important and incumbent upon us. And when I think about young people and their interest in politics, and I am so buoyed with hope when I think about the engagement of young people across the state.
It's very hopeful,
It
I
is.
think, yes.
They want us to act on the things that imperil their future. Climate change is one of those. Affordable health care is another. Student debt is another. And I am paying attention and listening. And I am grateful for young people engaging in our politics in an insistent way, in an urgent way, because I think they see that if we don't take action now, the future for themselves and for this country is dim.
Yes.
And it should be bright. And I'm going to work with them and anybody else who wants to join me to build that bright future.
And climate change is critical for us more than most states. We have so many families who rely on a healthy environment. They're in the resort business, or they are doing farm to table, and they're doing local produce, or they're doing larger scale farming. But keeping a healthy environment that will support these families going forward, it's so key to Minnesota once you leave the Twin Cities area. So much, and even what citizens within the Twin Cities enjoy going up north on the weekends. That environment is so critical and important to keep it healthy. So all the things you mentioned will do a large part, I think, in assuring that going forward, hopefully. Yeah.
Nice answer.
We just have a few seconds left, but I want to give viewers a chance to hear where they can most easily contact you and get a chance to know where your website is, where you list all of your policies and what you're working for, and they can connect and learn more. So your website.
Our website is murphyforminnesota.com.
Okay.
And you can find me there. You can reach out to the campaign there. But I want to say that the future is ours. It's ours to build. And I hope that you'll join me.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Roxanne Meshar, your host for Access to Democracy. Bye now.